Second example of postmodernism is marketing, politics as marketing, right, which we're all familiar with. So the two kinds of Russian propaganda, which I've already mentioned, each has a market. When the Russians say it's all, the Ukrainian revolution is all a geopolitical struggle, their market is the European left and parts of the American left, who really do kind of tend to think that America's behind everything. And therefore, if it's a geopolitical struggle, then maybe we should be against America rather than Russia. And most insidiously, if it's a geopolitical struggle, that just removes all of the Ukrainians from the picture entirely, right? If it's all about some chessboard between America and Russia, where it's just guys in ties in the Kremlin, or in the Pentagon thinking about things, then there are no real Ukrainians. There are no real human beings. There are no people who suffer. There's no one who takes risks. There's no one who votes in higher numbers than we do, right? There's no one fighting a war, even though they have no army. The people are evacuated from the scene completely in this geopolitical struggle. That's the market. It reaches us that way. Likewise, the idea, which they started out with, that the Ukrainians are all fascists, that had a market, right? The market was all of us who were concerned that the greatest danger comes from a renewal of fascism or from anti-Semitism. If you just say your enemy is a Nazi and a fascist over and over and over again, which some of them still do. I mean, the deputy prime minister of Russia, who himself is no friend of the left, actually had his party banned because of racist advertisings in an earlier, better era in Russian history. He refers to the Ukrainians still as the fascist Nazi junta. And someone has taught him that every time he refers to them, instead of saying Ukraine, he should say fascist Nazi junta. And if you say it over and over again, people might start to think it's plausible. If you say it enough times, it starts to sound ridiculous, right? Nazi fascist junta, Nazi fascist junta, Nazi fascist junta, Nazi fascist junta, Nazi fascist junta. But clearly he's aiming for a market. And the point about all this is that it works. You may not be convinced in the end, but it slows you down. It certainly slows you down at the very minimum. It creates a slippery world. Let me give you the third example of postmodernism, which we do, okay, which Fox News does, and this is where it came from, actually, and they perfected it. There's a Russian television broadcaster called Russia Today, which is, I think, the second largest English language broadcaster now in the world. And the way they present news, and this will be familiar, is they bring on 5 experts, each of whom present 5 different versions of what happened. One of which might even be true, right? But it doesn't matter, because when you hear the 5 different versions, at the end of it, A, you have no idea what actually happened. B, the event itself has been trivialized by this ridiculous discussion. And C, you've maybe lost a little bit more of whatever faith you might have had in journalism, right? And that is intentional. Okay, so in Russia Today or other Russian media outlets discuss, for example, the shooting down of the Malaysian airline flight over Ukraine, which was a real event in which 289 real people lost their lives. But the theories are thrown out about it, like this Malaysian airliner was the same one that disappeared over the Pacific, or this Malaysian airliner was launched from its runway with dead bodies who were put in there by the CIA, or this Ukrainian airliner was actually shot down by a Ukrainian fighter jet, or maybe an American fighter jet, or this Malaysian airliner was shot down by Ukrainian artillery, which is actually aiming for President Putin's plane. If you put enough of this stuff out there, right, then people might, I've probably just done it. You're going to go home and say, do you know the strangest thing? I just heard Professor Snyder say that UFOs carrying Elvis's baby shot down that plane, right? And this is how it works, right? That you give these multiple views, and at the end, something which really matters, right? The tragic death of children and women and men, something which really matters, at the end of it, it becomes nothing. And you don't really believe in journalism anymore. And that's what's intended. That's the final way this postmodern stuff works. Now, I'm already sort of testing you to see how deep this has gotten into us, and of course it comes from us in some considerable measure, and I'm getting back towards our title, which is From Propaganda to Reality, where the question is, where are we really in all of this, and how much of this comes from us and how much of it reaches us. Now, where this ultimately heads, I think, is to the dispensation, the dispensing of truth itself, or the dispensing of truth itself, that there is no such thing of truth. Truth has been dispensed with. And if you no longer believe in it, right? If you no longer believe in it, it's no longer there. And the hardest test of this would be the old Aristotelian test of, I'm in Chicago, I always like to say Aristotle when I'm in Chicago. The old Aristotelian, there's one University of Chicago graduate here who laughed at that. There's the old Aristotelian test of non-contradiction. So you might think, no, that's ridiculous, Professor Snyder. Of course, we follow the principle of non-contradiction. We don't allow ourselves to contradict ourselves on a daily basis. And if somebody else did, we'd catch it immediately. Okay, so let's see. Let me recite some things from Russian propaganda about this war, which you will have all heard probably in one way or another because the American media happily picks up most of this stuff. Let me just cite a couple of things and then let's see how we've been doing. You have heard there's no Ukrainian state. You've also heard the Ukrainian state is very repressive. You have heard there is no Ukrainian nation. You've also heard that all Ukrainians are nationalists. You have heard that there is no Ukrainian language. You have also heard that Russians are being forced to speak the Ukrainian language. Most disturbingly, you have heard that Russia is fighting a war to save the world from fascism, and you've also heard that maybe fascism isn't such a bad thing after all. Honestly, how much of that did you pick up? How much of the fact that the entire propaganda campaign from beginning to end was not just wrong, but self-contradictory? Honestly, how much of that was clear to all of us at the time? I think surprisingly and depressingly little. And this is the place where I want to try to bring this to an end. We are at a point where I really think we are at a point of to be or not to be for the West, whatever you might think of as the West. This policy of strategic relativism, of bringing down the various kinds of connections that exist, the transatlantic one, the European one, the integrity of states themselves, civil society, is ultimately about us as well. The policies against civil society, interestingly, are not just being pursued on the Maidan or in Russia, where NGOs are banned or are forced to advertise themselves as being foreign agents. They're also pursued here. Russian money is used to fund non-governmental organizations here, and then the Russians reveal that they're doing this, and then we all become skeptical about non-governmental organizations in general, right? Or journalists are paid to admit that they were working for the CIA by Russian money, and then we become a little more skeptical about journalism. All of this is not just about Ukraine. It's about something much, much, much bigger. And in that sense, I think it's best understood as a challenge. So we can say, what might sensible policy be? And I think there are answers to that, what sensible policy should be. If we really believe in these unities, if we believe in civil society or the integrity of states, or if we believe in European integration, or if we believe in the transatlantic relationship, it's probably a good time to say so, probably a good time to try to support those things. There are sensible policies. I think the best Russia policy is a good Ukraine policy, the thing that the United States government should be doing. In addition to sanctions against Russia, which are important because they force a conversation in Russia eventually, is to support the Ukrainian state as an example. If the Ukrainian state holds together, that's the best rebuff to this kind of policy. But fundamentally, and I can talk more about that, but fundamentally this is about concepts. I think fundamentally this is a kind of Orwellian moment. This is a moment where we decide whether we have concepts, whether we know who we really are. Because let me put it a different way. I described all this as tactics, the asymmetry, strategy, the relativism, and then philosophy, the postmodernism. But really, the philosophy is also the tactics. The philosophy comes first. If you buy into this version of postmodernism, then you are going to also buy into the strategic relativism, and then you're going to lose a whole lot of asymmetric battles, which is a description of what has happened in the last year, in large measure. Not a description of Ukraine and Russia. The Ukrainians are actually much more savvy about these things than we are, of course, because having had much more experience with them. It's not a description of Ukraine and Russia. It's a description of us. It's a description of us. If we buy into this kind of way of seeing the world, which is in part our way of seeing the world, we had a good hand in generating it, then there are certain consequences, like that there will be wars, there will be broken orders, there will be chaos. So I think really that's where we come to an end here. The title from propaganda to reality is not about Ukraine. You know, you can talk about Ukraine without talking about propaganda and reality. From a Ukrainian point of view, the things that have happened are actually fairly straightforward, and the way that we describe it from the outside can also be fairly straightforward. An authoritarian state has invaded a democratic state, destroying a European order. It's really not that complicated. It's happened that way. The reasons why we find it complicated are largely reasons which have to do with us, with our vulnerability to certain kinds of propaganda, and not really with reality. So ultimately, I see all this as a challenge. I mean, if you want to be optimistic, an interesting challenge, but I think a serious moral and intellectual challenge in which the people who come up with these ideas know us much better than we know them. These are serious, intelligent people who have to be taken seriously, which we're not, I think, at the moment doing very well. And what concerns me is the extent to which this event in Ukraine, which is important in all kinds of ways, has given way precisely to this yielding moment in our own culture. Because after all, if we see what's happened in Ukraine as nothing more than just some little conflict in some faraway country, if we see this as just a kind of politics as usual, well then, propaganda has already won, and reality has already lost, and the story is already over. Thank you. Thanks.